Welcome to the BBB National Programs podcast, The Bistro, where we will discuss today's hottest consumer trends, predict the future with consumer experts, and learn how elite businesses and entrepreneurs continue to push the envelope to meet and shape the consumer's needs in the marketplace.
Hello and welcome to the Bistro podcast. I'm your host, Elena Spinola. Well, it's 2020, and I certainly hope that all of you are out to a great start of this new year. There was a really funny meme that was floating around social media right in the beginning of the year with the Jetsons, and they were flying around in their flying vehicle, and the jokes and the posts were, "It's 2020. Isn't this what we all thought it was going to be?" And of course, I laughed along because I remember in 1980 watching that and going, yeah, surely by 2020 we'll be in flying cars. But of course, all good things come in time, and while we aren't in flying cars yet, cars today are connected to technology like never before, with new developments in vehicle digitization continuing to emerge at a rapid pace. Today on the Bistro, we're going to talk about connected cars, the personal data they collect, and the very unique privacy concerns that exist in this mobile context. Joining us today for this great conversation is John Verdi, Vice President of Policy with the Future of Privacy Forum. John, welcome to the Bistro. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we are thrilled to have you. And before we get into that discussion, can you share first a background of the Future of Privacy Forum? What's the mission of your organization? And also, how does FPF help advance best practices in data privacy, especially given this very rapid emerging digital world?
Sure. FPF is a think tank in Washington, D.C. We work on a range of consumer privacy issues, including connected cars, which we're going to talk about today. Lots of other things as well, everything from health to student data to de-identification to smart cities. And we come at these issues from a place of being optimists about data. We are optimistic about what data-driven products and services can do for individuals, for companies, and for society. But we're cognizant that data protection challenges, privacy risks, privacy harms are forever looming as new and unique ways are developed to collect, use, and share information. So our goal is to help craft best practices and other sorts of approaches to help maximize the benefits of data-driven technologies and mitigate the risks.
Sounds like a perfect goal to me. And before we get into the nuts and bolts again of the vehicle digitization, can you explain for anyone, where it isn't clear, what exactly constitutes a connected car?
Sure. So cars have collected and used data for a long time for purposes from tracking maintenance schedules to ensuring that engine timing is correct and appropriate, given certain mechanical factors. But increasingly in the past few years, cars have begun to collect vastly more information. They've begun to use it in unique and interesting ways for everything from safety purposes to entertainment purposes to maintenance purposes to environmental purposes. And I think that the key thing for individuals to understand is that cars are increasingly becoming platforms much more like a cell phone than they are like a simple mechanical means of transport.
Absolutely. I would agree with that. And, as you know, you can plug your cell phone right into the car and then all of your data is right there. If I want to call someone, I just tell my car to call someone. It's really interesting. And speaking of those types of personal data, what specifically is currently being collected by vehicles today?
Sure. The answer is it really depends. There are lots of different data platforms in vehicles today. It can vary by the maker. Mm-hmm. It can vary by the country. It can vary by the model. In some cases, it can vary by the trim level in the model. So there's no big picture exact answer for everyone. But to take your example, we do know that cars are increasingly able to connect to mobile phones for purposes of sharing information about contacts, about texting, about voice calls, about entertainment options like playing music and podcasts like this one. They also are able to track geolocation in some circumstances, to help plot routes, to avoid traffic, to reduce congestion. At the same time, cars are communicating with either car makers or other services and exchanging some of this information. Now, sometimes it's really safety critical information. Sometimes it's a car communicating with a traffic light or another signal to ensure that a vehicle doesn't run a red light. Sometimes it's a car using laser or radar technology to avoid rear-ending another vehicle. But all of that is based on the collection, use, and sometimes sharing of data.
Sure. And that's where it can get into that tricky data privacy, because this is your data and you might know that your car is collecting it. You might enjoy the fact that you can connect with your car in that way, but you don't know where that's being shared. Most consumers might not be aware. And in talking about this sort of mobility context, are there unique and very specific privacy concerns compared to other technologies? And what should we all be aware of?
Sure. So I think that the first privacy risk that's raised by connected vehicles is basically a contextual risk. It's individuals who, typically speaking, purchase or lease vehicles pretty infrequently. You don't often have people changing their cars as often as they change their cell phone, for example. And that means when someone buys a new car or leases a new car or goes on vacation and rents a new car, it means that they are likely to be engaging with technology that is significantly more advanced than their previous vehicle. So someone who is used to a totally unconnected car might go out and buy a new vehicle and all of a sudden be able to share contacts, to share location information, to call on a service like OnStar to help them if they have an accident or a medical emergency when they're in their vehicle. The second privacy question comes up when it comes to vehicles collecting significant personal data, like historical location data, right? Which even if a comprehensive record of your vehicle travels or my vehicle travels over the course of a week, a month, a year, even if that's not actually linked to our identity, if that information is placed into a data set, it's relatively easy to re-identify that information and say, oh, this looks like John. This looks like John's car. It looks like his travels, because where I live is basically a matter of public record. Mm-hmm. Where I work is basically a matter of public record. And the re-identification risks in large data sets can hinge quite significantly on the amount of location data that's collected or combined.
Sure, that makes sense. And, quick funny story, we actually purchased a certified pre-owned car last year, and I went to connect my Bluetooth, mm-hmm. and it pulled up the name of the previous person who owned the car. His name and some information was there. I didn't play too further, and I'm not super tech, so I wasn't all up in it. But I thought that was really interesting that it was still there.
Well, you're not alone. That's a frequent experience with folks who purchase a pre-owned car, for folks who purchase a car coming off of a lease, for individuals who rent cars when they go on vacation. I actually have something of a habit when I rent a car and I go on vacation. There's a couple little key presses one can do on most infotainment systems to take a look at what the paired devices are historically on that car. Now, these are individuals who have rented a car. Perhaps they've shared contact information, they've shared message information, they've linked apps, they've shared other sorts of personal information with the car during the time that they rented it, and then they neglected to delete that information before they returned the rental car. And when I do that, I universally find historically paired phones on those vehicles, and sometimes it's dozens and dozens. Mm-hmm. It really can be much more than just a previous owner off a certified pre-owned vehicle. It can be dozens of individuals who have shared sometimes sensitive personal information with that car. We've published a set of best practices on this issue to try to help consumers when they either trade in a lease, when they sell a car, when they return a rental car, to talk to them about how they can quickly and efficiently unlink their phones, delete their data, delete their information. This is increasingly important because cars, connected systems are moving beyond the mere address book and linking of contact information, and they are moving on to apps that can start cars remotely, that can enable various safety functions or disable various safety functions of vehicles. And as these cars become smarter and more connected, the cybersecurity risks increase.
That's exactly what I wanted to talk about, moving beyond there. So we have a sense of what the potential concerns are now, but as new developments in technology continue to emerge in the space, what insights can you share about the future of some data privacy concerns that may evolve?
Well, it's always hard to say, and it's difficult to prognosticate in this space. But I think it's become pretty clear that the advances in the automotive field have been incremental rather than seismic. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of conversation about autonomous vehicles, about self-driving vehicles, about what happens when your car drives you instead of you driving your car. I think that process is beginning to look more like a progressive process rather than a process where someone wakes up one day and says, oh my goodness, I used to have a car that I drove and today my car's driving me. So let me give you an example. Today, there are lots of cars on the market that will give drivers warnings if they turn on their blinker to merge into another lane on the highway.
Yes.
And there's a car in their blind spot. Now, that car doesn't prevent the driver from merging into the adjacent car, but it does provide a smart warning to try to increase the safety of everybody involved. There are also cars on the market that have some technical measures in place that will actually prevent rear-end collisions. They have sensors on the front bumper that no matter how hard an individual presses the gas pedal to the floor, their car will not rear-end the car in front of them. Right? So that's taking a little bit of control away from the driver for a very good reason, reducing accidents, increasing safety, and moving along the spectrum towards full autonomy.
Sure.
So as drivers and automakers and service providers and others in this ecosystem move towards what starts to look like increased autonomy in vehicles, one of the things that happens is increased collection, use, and sharing of data.
Got it.
So when we think about the future, it looks like a gradual process. Might be quick, might be slow, depending on the particular circumstance. But it's a gradual process of increasing data points, increasing volume of data. And the question is, how do we safeguard that data to make sure that individuals' safety is protected when they're in vehicles, how pedestrians and cyclists and other folks who use the road benefit from this new technology, while at the same time making sure that individuals' data is not placed at risk.
Right. And speaking of that, are there industry guidelines that are being integrated in terms of providing these privacy safeguards?
So there are, and it's a pretty typical trajectory, actually, moving from a self-regulatory posture to a little bit more of a regulatory posture when it comes to government intervention of rules or laws. And right now, some of the leading best practices and codes of conduct have been promulgated from within industry. There are protections in place that all of the major global automakers have signed on to make sure that car makers and others do not collect and share and sell sensitive personal information without consent, without affirmative opt-in consent. That's one of the core principles, that users pick and choose what they want to share and how they want to share it, and that they're aware of what the trade-off is. They benefit in terms of safety and convenience. They trade that off for sharing a bit of their data if they're unconcerned about any potential downsides, or they elect to not benefit from that convenience and they elect to not benefit from that safety, and they decide to not share the data, right? That kind of consumer choice is really at the heart of the current model. There are, of course, government regulators like the U.S. Department of Transportation, like the Departments of Transportation in various states, who are contemplating new rules and laws to try to govern how some of this data flows. But that's something that's more on the horizon than current right now.
Good to know. I was just going to ask about the current regulatory laws. Thank you for kind of walking us through that. I also was going to ask about the opt-in, opt-out. So people, a user, someone who rents or buys a car, has the option, depending on the car, the make, the model, to opt out of some of these things.
Right. So typically, and again, this is very broad strokes, but typically the model has been opt-in for sensitive data, like historical geolocation and things like that, and then potentially opt-out or no choice at all for things like engine management data, the oily bits of operating a car, the maintenance schedules, the data that drives apps that help you understand when you need to service your brakes or things like that. So there is a distinction between opt-in and opt-out in this space. It varies in some circumstances by maker and by model. There are some norms, as I said, in the space where it's really opt-in for selling sensitive data. But at the same time, there are government entities and private researchers who could really benefit from analyzing some of the big data sets here, particularly if they're shared in a de-identified way And there are policy, legal, and technical protections in place that can safeguard some of that information, that can increase safety, reduce emissions, and make all of our commutes shorter.
Sure. I was going to ask, but it sounds like, of course, because every car is different and every user will decide on what they want to opt in or opt out of based on what options they have. But we were wondering what options should manufacturers be offering that currently aren't being offered as an opt-in, opt-out. But I guess that remains to be seen as cars continue to emerge in this tech space, like autonomous cars, et cetera.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the level of autonomy in the vehicle. It depends on the relationship of the individual to the service, because it isn't just car makers who are offering these services, right? It's every company that has an app that lives on your phone, your iPhone or your Android phone. They have an opportunity to provide a car version of that app. Now, sometimes that makes a lot of sense. Navigation apps, for example, it makes a ton of sense to integrate into the in-car experience on your cell phone. Music apps and entertainment apps, that makes a ton of sense too. I think we're increasingly going to be seeing other sorts of apps that seek to integrate themselves into that process. And you then have the cell phone makers. You have Apple and Google and lots of other folks who have their operating systems that are tied in to cars. And then you have other folks like OnStar, for example, which is not a mobile phone based service, but an in-car based service that's not provided, strictly speaking, by the car maker, but does provide some safety features and some communication features and some other benefits. So there's a pretty diverse marketplace. And I think the options that consumers have is really dictated by the relationship between the consumer and the individual entity. It's a pretty diverse marketplace right now. I think there's some concern in Congress and in some state legislatures about the diversity of that market. I think there are some lawmakers who would like to see consumers have some standardized options and some standardized protections in place. And aside from the self-regulatory framework that I talked about, I think that standardization is something that we're growing towards rather than something that's implemented on the ground today.
Sure. And speaking of consumers, what are your thoughts on insights around what consumers are saying that might affect the landscape of the best practices and the regulations? Are consumers demanding certain things? Are they asking for certain things? Or what are your thoughts there?
Well, I think what's really challenging is that both car dealers and consumers neither of those folks are cybersecurity experts. Neither of those folks are data protection experts. So the idea that this sort of the desires of consumers in this space are going to be accurately reflected in the market is kind of questionable.
Yeah.
I think that what we do see, though, is we see a set of fairly highly educated consumers driving the discussion, pun intended, about a lot of these features and about a lot of these risks. And I think the car makers and the other folks in this ecosystem are quite sophisticated about engaging in this conversation because they're fairly highly regulated entities for a lot of purposes other than privacy. So when you think about the safety features and the standardization on global automakers, when it comes to turn signals, when it comes to brake lights, when it comes to emissions, when it comes to a variety of other things, this is an industry that is used to working within a regulatory framework. And I see those sorts of choices and the future of this being driven much more by policymakers, a fairly narrow group of savvy consumers, and the companies themselves.
Got it. Well, thank you for sharing that. That's very insightful. And I think, again, it's that fine balance between consumers wanting all of this convenience and then understanding, whoa, wait a second, what about my data? I'm sharing, I want the convenience, I want the tech, but I don't know if I'm going to be compromised or if I want that. And it all will unfold. Speaking of which, as we wrap up here, John, what do you foresee the future of data privacy in connected cars in the next, 5-10 years? Do you see it changing dramatically? Or as you mentioned, it's sort of this gradual, we are gradually seeing this emerge.
Yeah, I think it's a gradual process to get to some dramatically different endpoints. And the biggest thing that is out there right now are the varying levels of autonomy or self-driving. And I think that individuals are going to think about their relationships to their data and to vehicles very differently, depending on whether it is the current model, which is largely individual or family owns a particular vehicle and is very comfortable with the idea that that vehicle is storing significant data about them locally. perhaps sharing a bit off the vehicle, perhaps sharing a bit with some products and services through the cell phone, through some other connectivity, with the automaker, when they go to the dealership, et cetera, versus a kind of rideshare model, particularly driven by autonomy. And I think that as we move towards that world, those data protection challenges, as we move from car to car and device to device and our data follows us, it's super important that the data protections travel with the personal information.
Makes sense. John, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today, share these really great insights. Can you share the Future of Privacy Forum website with our audience?
Absolutely. If you want to learn more about these issues or other consumer privacy issues, please check us out at fpf.org.
Okay. John, thank you so much.
Thank you.
To our listeners, we also want to thank you for tuning in today. We invite you to be part of this discussion by sharing your thoughts and your views with us. Just go to www.betterbusiness.blueberry.com. And if you haven't already, subscribe to The Bistro and you can see our whole list and hear more great podcast episodes. For BBB National Programs, I'm Elena Spinola. Until next time, it has been my pleasure discussing better business and data privacy in connected cars with you.
You just enjoyed the Bistro podcast. Be sure to tune in next time for a brand new episode. To learn more about our other shows, visit betterbusiness.blueberry.com. That's betterbusiness.blueberry.com. Follow us on Twitter at BBB_NTL programs. Send your comments and ideas to podcast@bbbnp.org. The thoughts and opinions expressed on this podcast are the views and opinions of the guests, not those of the BBB National Programs or its affiliates. This podcast is for information and educational purposes only and is copyrighted with all rights reserved. This podcast is protected by Blueberry's Terms of Service.